Deandre Ayton reportedly staying put on today's episode of Locked On Suns. Right move? Wrong move? And how do they fill out this roster if Ayton's not going out in a trade? Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 6 seasons and a writer at Suns.com, the host of the Just Basketball Show wherever you get podcasts. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen to start your week. Happy Monday. Welcome to the show. We're here and we're free and we're available on all podcast platforms every single day for you. So if you want to stay locked on to the Phoenix Suns, your favorite NBA team, go ahead and hit follow or subscribe wherever you are finding us. Become an everydayer here on the show. Let's talk Deandre Ayton. Big news of the weekend. John Gambadoro had it late last week, sort of heading into the draft, coming out of the draft, and then Chris Haynes doubled up, piggybacked, whatever you want to say, on all of that on Sunday afternoon with a very similar report, basically indicating the Suns have chosen to move forward with Ayton. Not a surprise per se, but nevertheless, big news, right? I mean, obviously, this was sort of the next domino that a lot of people expected after Bradley Beal arrived here, which was finalized on draft day. Chris Paul going to Golden State. A lot has happened since you and I last spoke. All of you everydayers, maybe some of you just along for the postseason ride, but regardless, that is where we are. So, why did we get here? How did we get here? I just don't think the Ayton market was as strong as people expected it to be. And this is one that I have maintained all along. You know, I might have still done. I'm sure there were trades. Let's start there, right? I'm sure there were options available to the Suns. So when you hear that Ayton is staying put and there was not much of a market and this and that, I don't think this is the same thing as, let's say, last summer when you think back to effectively only Indiana seemed willing to give Deandre Ayton an offer sheet. Some other teams, maybe someone else would have blinked along the way during his restricted free agency in 2022, but it ended up being the Pacers, and it ended up being quite a few days into free agency by the time that happened. So I think this was probably a little different. I doubt it was just one team. I doubt it was just one offer. But I don't think that offer obviously was good enough to do, and I'm not surprised by that. I think that a lot of what you were hearing from other... Look, I'm not attacking anybody directly. It's just a matter of opinion, but I do think the Suns deciding to keep Ayton bears it out, which is just what you were hearing from any number of writers and other people here locally or even nationally, was just an outsized grip on what it was that Ayton was worth around the NBA. I just did not see it, and some of it does trace back to the fact that there wasn't a market for him in sign-and-trade opportunities last summer for teams that maybe didn't have the cap space to sign him to the offer sheet. That, again, there were not a lot of teams that wanted to give him that offer sheet in the first place at that max number. And so this is where you leave us. This is where it leaves us. I will say, again, just to give some context here, you know, I heard PHNX reported that there was a Mavs offer with number 10 on the table, that there was a Magic offer that may have included Wendell Carter or Markelle Fultz. Fultz maybe makes a little more sense. I'm not arguing or denying what those people reported. I think they do great work. I believe that they heard that. I'm not sure how legitimate those offers really could have been, because I think if they were there, the Suns would have taken them. You don't keep Deandre Ayton if the 10th overall pick and, you know, decent role players are on the table. You do not keep Deandre Ayton if Wendell Carter, who may very well be better. I understand that there's injury concerns and he's still reaching his peak, whereas Ayton is a little older. I guess I understand all of that, but that does not take away from the fact that I just think if if those trades were there, Ayton would not be a member of the Phoenix Suns today, and that's where I come down that it must not have been that substantive. The trade that I came up with way back at the beginning of this whole offseason when I did a show on the best case scenario Suns offseason, and obviously it was not just best case scenario rainbows and butterflies where I got on the microphone and lied to all of you for, a whole show. It was realistic, but good. Realistic, but maybe on the better side of the realistic pathways. And even with trying to make it as rosy and positive as I could, the best real thing I could convince myself on the trade market, the best thing I could convince myself of was Ayton to Charlotte for Terry Rozier, Cody Martin, and not the obviously not the number 2 overall pick, but a future lottery protected first was what I said. I saw versions of that deal going around in Suns world on the internet. That would include the 34th overall pick this year that Charlotte had. Either one of those, pretty equivalent. Now, I think that part of what's interesting here is that I do think things changed when they got Beal. And I do think that one of the things I'm most curious about here, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about free agency and how they fill out the rest of this roster, is with the Beal side, somebody like Rozier obviously just makes less sense, right? So I think in a lot of cases, some of the trades that you would talk about if you were looking for Ayton trades were either for guards or for other bigs or for both, right? Not a lot of NBA teams are in the business of trading wings for bigs. So, as much as you could say, oh, the Hawks, let's send Deandre Ayton to the Hawks and then the Suns get back DeAndre Hunter. It's not going to happen. So with the guard side, Beal kind of reduced the need for somebody like that. On the big man side, I just think the reality is it's very difficult to convince a team to trade a decent big who the Suns might want, who might start for the Suns, for Ayton. In most cases, whether it's Wendell Carter, like I just said, with Charlotte, Mark Williams, Nick Richards, they have 2 guys, one of which in Richards, who they just re-signed. Indiana, Miles Turner, a lot of these guys are already under contract and already pretty solid. That's why the Suns would have been targeting them. And so if you look at it from that perspective, it's just, why would the other side of that trade? Why would the other team do that, right? And that's really where this all comes down. And, I put something online today that we'll talk about that in the next segment. We'll talk about what he needs to do and how his game will change, because I think there's an interesting conversation to be had now that we're under the assumption he'll be back. The point is, as much as I know people don't want to hear this, but it's the reality. The problem, the initial, the original sin, right, of this whole experiment with Ayton in Phoenix was drafting him number 1 overall. You don't hear Robert Williams, who makes like $12 to $15 million a year. Nobody cares about his injury risks or his inconsistency. The Celtics are a great team no matter what Robert Williams does, and they have the means to build their roster out like they just did with the Kristaps Porzingis trade, regardless of what Robert Williams is up to, what his salary is. Well, it's not regardless of what his salary is, but it's so small that they don't have to worry about it. What happens when you draft Ayton number 1 is that he's always going to be a number 1 overall pick from then on out, right? And so that is a leverage that Ayton's agent can use in negotiations at the extension deadline back in 2021. That is something that his agent can then use last year in free agency and on and on. And so nothing about this has ever been that Deandre Ayton is not a good player, that he can't be on a championship team, that he has no role on a championship team. Suns were 2 wins from a title with him on their team 2 years ago. It's obvious that is a possibility and maybe a likelihood. I mean, I don't know. It depends on how you feel about Ayton as a player. That's not really what we're talking about when we talk about trades. What we're talking about with trades is that player on that contract. And so drafting him number 1 overall, creating the valuation such as it was, and then now having to deal with the fact that he got paid in accordance with being a number 1 overall pick, leaves you with a situation where Indiana, Atlanta, Orlando, whoever it might be, even the Mavs now with Derek Lively, who they drafted, fit in here. It makes no sense for any of those teams to trade for a $30 million center whose ceiling is unclear, for one of their own centers who might be also, still building toward a ceiling, or even if they're capped out at what their ceiling already is, they're probably cheaper, as we've seen with Miles Turner. So that's where things are. That is, I think, why there was no trade made. And so that leaves us with Ayton on this team. Ayton as the 4th star on this new look Phoenix Suns roster. So let's talk next about how Ayton will have to evolve his game in order to fit with that new look roster. First, a quick word from eBay Motors. I actually really like eBay Motors. I don't have to exaggerate or do anything like that because I've used them. I'll tell you about it in a second. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. Bought a wheel cover for my Hyundai Elantra recently. Got that bad boy on there. Less than $20. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage. Look for the green check to know the part will fit or get your money back. That's what they do. You add the trim, make, model, all that stuff into your account, and then it tells you, hey, this part will work, this part won't work, etc. It helped me. It'll help you. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop at eBay Motors. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. So get the right parts, the right price, and the right fit on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit only. Available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Alrighty, let's continue. How does Deandre Ayton need to adjust his game? That is the big question. That is where everybody's attention will turn. And if you just think back not that long ago, maybe a week or two, to the point at which we knew the Suns had Frank Vogel as their head coach, but we did not yet know that there was such a thing as a Bradley Beal trade available to the Phoenix Suns. Think back to that point in time. What do you remember? Probably that we were talking a lot about Ayton, and probably that we were talking a lot about keeping Deandre Ayton here in the Valley, that the Suns maybe should go ahead and do that because of what Vogel might what he might open up for Ayton to become, right? Defensively especially. So let's start there. I put out on Twitter because, look, sometimes I'll give you a little bit of a hint. Maybe there's some of you. I know there's some young people who listen to this show who, want to be content creators. Maybe some of you don't care at all. Either way, let me just go ahead and say this right now. Easy way to get some Twitter attention in Suns world is to tweet about Deandre Ayton. That's just a pro tip, free advice for all of you. So I did that like a dummy, as I do, because I just had a problem with the way that Ayton was getting discussed after all of this, because I just think it's very difficult to analyze somebody given the baggage that Ayton now has on him, right? And just to summarize quickly, coming out of college, as I just got done saying in that last segment, I was not of the belief that Deandre Ayton should be the number 1 overall player in that draft. I had him, I believe, 4th in that draft behind Luka, Trey, and Jaren Jackson Jr. Not saying that's still my order, but that's on the record. You can go look up articles where I wrote that. And so I was critical of him. I did not think that he had the mental focus and toughness and energy and commitment and effort that was going to be needed to be an elite defensive center and to buy into what it is that it seemed like the role he was going to need to fill, because his jump shot never came. His dribble, drive game, face-up game, anything with the ball in his hands, that never really developed for him outside of some hook shots and post-up skills. That has developed, but not a lot else offensively, and defensively it's come and it's gone. That's all well and good. What we saw in 2021 should have changed a lot of people's views of Deandre Ayton. It proved that he can be on a great team. It proved that he can play well in the playoffs and make a real impact. Since then, basically ever since then, you have had a situation where Deandre Ayton had a bad relationship with his head coach, was further and further and further minimized within the offense, and that has to factor in how you evaluate this guy as well, right? It's not that it's one or the other. You either love him and you think he was hated by his coach and that's why he wasn't very good at times, or you think he was a piece of crap and has no hope in the NBA, and it's not one or the other. It's both. He has had inconsistent effort. He has struggled to develop his game on offense and at times on defense. But also, for 2 years running, he had suboptimal, team environment conditions that might have held him back as well. There can be multiple things that hold people back in their profession and in their lives and everything else. So that's where we are. Vogel might be able to, especially on the defensive end, put together and empower Ayton within a scheme that really maximizes and brings a new level of play out of him. I think being more versatile in how he defends the pick and roll, I think switching more, I think maybe playing with more size overall if they're able to get another winger forward in here and you have a full season of Durant's rim protection and, potentially some more veteran wing defense in there. Those things would all help. Offensively, I actually think there's something to be said as well, but it's especially interesting to think about it now that we know Chris Paul is not coming back, which obviously we've known for a while, but with him, that trade being finalized and everything else, it's a good opportunity to think about it. A lot of chatter this week about Chris Paul going to Golden State, right? And how he's going to need to change his game because his pick and roll stuff with the ball in his hands, that's just not a fit for what Golden State does. The same is true of Deandre Ayton. I mean, you think back to last year, just a few weeks ago, in the first round especially of that Clippers series, right? I frequently said the Suns have three offenses, right? The Chris Paul and DeAndre Ayton two-man game with shooters around that. The Devin Booker ball in his hand stuff, which can be pick and roll, which, has a variety to it. And then the Kevin Durant isolations. The best version of that offense was ball in Booker's hands with Durant off the ball, Paul off the ball, and often Ayton as that screener. But that was really just a screen for Booker to get some space and manipulate the big man defender and create for himself or a shooter. There wasn't really a lot of Booker to Ayton connection, and so whenever the real, and honestly the Durant and Ayton connection that looked pretty solid at times in the regular season, that pretty much went by the wayside as well by the time the playoffs came around. And so really the only times when DeAndre Ayton was able to make an impact offensively was with Chris Paul. So the fact that he's gone is important here as well, in addition to Monty being gone. I'm not sure what Frank Vogel will do with DeAndre Ayton. There's a lot of, sort of almost jokes about how Vogel would give the obligatory sets, call some plays for guys like Dwight Howard and JaVale McGee and others during his time with the Lakers just to sort of, keep the big man happy, feed the big man, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe there will be some of that. That's not going to make or break what Ayton is as an offensive player. What will make or break it, is... can you empower him and put him in positions to... I think there is still more to his face-up game. I've brought up multiple times over the past couple of months as we've been talking about if Ayton will be a Sun this upcoming season again or not. That Pelican series, especially after Devin Booker went out, right? That's the best stretch of offensive basketball that DeAndre Ayton has ever played. He was bodying Jonas Valanciunas. He was bodying Larry Nance. He was dribbling past those guys. He was spinning for hook shots and layups and floaters and flip shots and all the rest. And if that's there in the playoffs against a pretty feisty New Orleans team, that is there still as we head toward October. And so I would hope that Vogel tries to bring that out of him, But there's also just some simple stuff, even if it's just playing simple basketball in a lot of the ways that he already has been for this team, that can help. Running the second unit offense more through Ayton. And it's not just going to be Ayton, obviously, because there's three big-time scorers on this team with Booker, Durant, and Beal now, but can a second unit be Booker and Ayton? on the court with bench players? Can it be Beal and Ayton? Can it be Durant and Ayton? I think if you have two of those guys on the court at all times, good things will happen. But when it's just Ayton and one of the other guys, that should be a time where the team is looking to find ways to set him up to be a scorer. It doesn't have to be complicated. This guy is not going to be a focal point. He's not going to be scoring 20 points per game. There are elements that he needs to develop as a player if he wants to continue to get offensive opportunities. I am not advocating for feeding him to make him happy and all that kind of nonsense. We are beyond that. The man is entering the 6th year of his career. It's just not, it's not what it's going to be. But there are simple things that Monty Williams never did that could just result in production, engagement, everything else that Vogel can start to put into place. And that might actually be easier without Chris Paul because it won't just be looked at as Ayton gets his when he gets in the pick and roll with Chris. And that's that. Leave it alone. Nothing else to talk about. That's it. Without Paul, you got to get creative. You have to find ways to make the most of what Deandre Ayton is. And I almost think that impetus to change might actually just benefit everybody in the long run because it's just back to the drawing board rather than the status quo. If the Suns keep Ayton, you can say goodbye to those dreams of Brook Lopez or Mason Plumlee coming to Phoenix on the minimum, and you got to start looking elsewhere. So what does this mean for the rest of the roster? We'll talk about it next. First, another quick break. And we're back. All right, closing things out. Let's talk free agents. So I really was an advocate, as I talked about at the very beginning of this show with the Rozier Martin draft pick trade with Charlotte. Notice I was not trying to bring back Nick Richards or Mark Williams in that trade. I liked the idea of trying to potentially get guards and wings, even if they're buy low guys or bad contract guys or whatever the case was, bring back more perimeter talent and then go bargain bin hunting at the center position, whether that was some combination of Jock Landale and Bismack Biyombo, guys like Mason Plumlee and Brook Lopez, even Paul Reed or Jackson Hayes potentially, depending on what comes of his, personal situation. All those guys you've heard me talk about a lot if you're an everydayer and you've been tracking this throughout the postseason. If the Suns keep Ayton, they don't need to go get anybody like that on the minimum. Ayton will be their starter. Jock Landale will be their backup. Maybe Bismack Biyombo comes back as depth, but either way, that's the rotation. Which begs the question, well then what are the players that the Suns then need to go out and get? I would say it is probably, it seems pretty likely to me that Campaign will be back. His guarantee date is June 29th. I don't know what's going to happen now that the draft has come and gone between now and June 29th that would make the Suns decide to get rid of Cameron Payne. I think the only thing that would have gotten them to get rid of Cameron Payne was if a guard, a playable NBA rotation guard came back in an Ayton trade. Again, if that's not happening, then there's no real need to mess with it. You keep Payne. He's a $6 million salary, which is a nice thing to have. Remember, the Suns are only going to be able to sign guys in the $2 to $3 million range this offseason now. So that's where we are. Guards, wings, forwards, that's what you're looking at with these minimum deals. I will just reiterate, too, here, for the sake of saying it. It sounds fairly likely from what John Gambadoro and Brian Windhorst and other people have been saying that in addition to Payne, Craig, Lee, Okogie, in addition to the centers, will probably be back. So let's say those guys all come back. Durant, Booker, Ayton, Beal. That's 4. Payne is 5. Craig is 6. Lee is 7. Biyombo, Okogie, 8, 9. Jock Landale, 10. So really, and then I'm not going to talk about the draft pick because I don't feel equipped to talk about the draft pick, and you can look elsewhere for a lot of incredible excitement about somebody whose name we did not know before Thursday. And I love each and every one of the people who are analyzing the man. I obviously know that's part of the deal. It's just a little funny to me, so I'm not going to be the one to do that. But that's 11. I think Kamara, I actually don't even know how to say his name. Look at that. A professional broadcaster here in my guest room. he might be a two-way contract, to be honest with you. But either way, let's just say it's 11 or let's say it's 10. It doesn't really matter. That's 4 or 5 spots. But maybe more importantly than saying 4 or 5 spots, it's not a lot of rotation spots left over. If you think Craig is probably at this current moment, it's Craig or Okogie as the fifth starter for this team. Not sure if that holds, but let's just say that's the starting lineup. One of those guys is the backup wing. Lee is a backup guard. I'm not sure if he'll be the backup 2 guard, but Payne Lee, Craig, Landale is already your second unit, and then another forward in there potentially might help. And that's already your 10. I'm not saying you can't bump some of those guys down. I don't know if Damian Lee is somebody you necessarily want in a consistent full-time rotation role. I think we've seen his limitations as a put the ball on the ground guy, as a defensive player, and everything else. So maybe you're saying 2 rotation spots at this point. So let's talk about who those could be. I really like the idea of Lindy Waters from the Thunder. He lit the Suns up, which is probably why you remember him. But a lot of the guys I like have team options. And so, or they're restricted or some combination of both. So Lindy Waters is on there. Yuta Watanabe is another shooter with size. He is unrestricted. His name has kind of been out there quite a bit. Trey Lyles is still out there for me as somebody I think could really make an impact. George Niang, although I don't think he made more than the minimum last year, so I kind of doubt, he's 30, but he's still a pretty productive guy for his role. I really have a hard time imagining that he doesn't just take more money, that he would already be at the point where he's accepting a really small role. Jalen McDaniels, so not the Minnesota one, but the guy who got traded to Philly. I think he's somebody you could see the Suns pursue, especially now with Frank Vogel. Jalen McDaniels, maybe think of what he might do on this team as somewhat similar to what Kyle Kuzma did for that championship Lakers team. Another one to look at here while we're talking about forwards is Wenyen Gabriel. I think he's a really solid player. He has familiarity with Frank Vogel coming from that Lakers organization, but not even just Frank Vogel. Maybe most importantly is a lot of the player development staff from the Lakers. So Wenyen Gabriel is 26, but not a ton of NBA experience, more as his career has gone on. I really like, that's a player, as I was looking back through this kind of today for the first time in a while, where I was like, he is a different kind of big. It would probably mean no more Bismack Biyombo. Those two are pretty similar. But at 6'9", 26 years old, he's kind of hitting his prime, 7'1" wingspan, very, very solid athlete, somebody who can finish, block shots, rebound, maybe not an elite rebounder, but obviously he is a big man. You would expect he can do a little bit of that. So he's somebody I would be looking at. Let's flip the guards here. Najee Marshall is somebody I brought up as well, and that's another forward. It's another team option guy, though. The Pelicans would have to decide to move on from Najee, which they could. They have a roster logjam a little bit, and I think he's somebody who can play on a good team, but that's where that one is. Guard-wise, you're not getting Gabe Vincent. You're not getting Max Strus. Shake Milton is somebody who I think the theory of Shake Milton has always been pretty intriguing, but never really a guy who's come together, and he's already 27 years old. Jalen Noel, Minnesota guy, very small decision-making, shot selection, have been questions in the past for him, but you're not going to get a lot of other 24-year-olds who you might be able to get on the minimum. The Josh Okogie special, take the guy from Minnesota and bring him in if they don't want him. I'm not sure if they don't want him. I think they should want him, but we'll see. Dennis Schroeder is already a name obviously. And I think you start to get toward the end of the list very quickly. Lonnie Walker, he had his game, right? But there's a reason there was only the Lonnie Walker game, not the Lonnie Walker games or the Lonnie Walker series. He is just a limited player. That shot doesn't always go in. Decision-making, he's not a great passer or anything like that, and he's just a little small for what you want him to be as a wing, So that's kind of the question mark there. Dante DiVincenzo has a player option, so if he wants, if If he wants money or he wants to be on a good team, neither one of those things really lead him to the Suns. If he wants to be on a great team and not worry about money, he's just going to go back to the Warriors. If he wants to make more money and not necessarily be on a great team, he'll opt out and go take the money. Neither one of those things are happening in Phoenix. Austin Rivers, Wesley Matthews, Matthew Dellavedova, Raul Neto, none of those guys, they're not making a huge difference. One interesting one to close us out here is Dennis Smith Jr. He went to Charlotte at the end of last season, and granted, it's the stretch run of the NBA season. A lot can be fluctuate and be a little weird. But that team locked down defensively under Steve Clifford to close out the year. LaMelo Ball got hurt, not an elite defender. Some of their other guys, young guys, were out, and they just really started to defend at a high level. That's a big part of why Nick Richards got his extension. And Mark Williams started to look pretty solid at times there. I believe JT Thor or some of their other young players actually did make a little bit of an impact, but really it was vets, and the guy at guard was Dennis Smith Jr. I think he's worth a flyer if for nothing else than to be a defensive specialist, similar to what Josh Okogie sort of is for you. I think that's the type of guy, when you're talking about roster spots 11 through 15 on a minimum, that's worth trying. Similar, Javon Carter, can he just hound people? He's not as big or physical as Alex Caruso, but obviously we know Frank Vogel had a really big role in bringing Alex Caruso's career up from, fringe NBA guy to finals difference maker, guarding Jimmy Butler and Tyler Hero and everybody else. So that could be one. It's going to be specialists, especially if you're not talking about centers, because centers are the most sort of undervalued position in the league, which is another good reason to trade Ayton. If you can get, again, Mason Plumlee at the minimum, that's more likely. You're not getting a, Karis LeVert, not a very desirable player. He is, not as old, but he is the Mason Plumlee of guards, right? But because he's a guard and the NBA likes those more, you're not getting Karis LeVert on the minimum, right? Whereas you could get a Plumlee or a Brook Lopez or a Paul Reed on the minimum. That's kind of the difference here. And so that's why it's harder to thread the needle, and that's why the options are a little more limited, and why it's going to be harder for the Suns to pull this off. Keeping Ayton, there is upside there, but it limits the roster. There's no way around that. Those are some of the options as they do look forward. But really, to me, what keeping Ayton means is actually keeping a lot more of the other guys. More likely even than before that Craig, Okogie, Lee, Payne, Landale are back. I'm looking at what Darius Bazley, if he comes back, and then who are the couple of guys on the minimum that they get, some of the names I just listed, to fill this thing out. That'll wrap us up. We got Brandon Duenas on Tuesday. We've got Aaron Edwards Wednesday or Thursday or Friday. And free agency starts Friday evening, everybody. So get on board, hit follow, hit subscribe. We'll be here every day, getting through this together, having fun, keeping up with your Phoenix Suns. Talk to you tomorrow.